I hear the military loves hiring women these days. Guess your posting is just filing reports in some admin office, yeah? Because you certainly don't look like you've ever fired an actual weapon. The words fell across the dining table like a heavy stone. Marguerite let out a sharp laugh. Then the air went completely still. My body did exactly what it was trained to do under threat. My heart rate dropped to 12 beats per minute. My breathing flattened out, silent through my nose. I kept my eyes locked directly on Rupert's throat. He was running hot. His pulse was erratic, fueled by expensive scotch and a desperate need to break me in front of an audience. Quick pause before we dive in. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I'm always curious to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now, onto the story. Across the table, Uncle Malcolm froze. The old Marine's shoulders locked into position. His wine glass hovered an inch from his lips. Malcolm was the only other person in this room who knew what a severed artery sounded like. He felt the sudden, violent shift in the room's pressure. The space between us turned thick, heavy, suffocating. 1 second of silence stretched out before snapping my mind backward 3 hours. The engine of my battered Ford groaned before finally dying in the driveway. Weybridge, Surrey. A pristine colonial wrapped in white cladding. The perfect suburban dream financed by a nightmare I lived every single day. I sat behind the steering wheel. My thumbs, heavily calloused from years of gripping things designed to tear through flesh and bone, traced the crisp edge of the paper in my lap. £5,400. Hazard pay. The exact calculated price of my life for 35 days in Helmand. Every pound of that blood money was about to be endorsed and shoved directly into the mortgage of this very house. Marguerite's house. The house I kept out of foreclosure while getting shot at in a place most people couldn't point to on a map. I folded the check once and shoved it deep into my jeans. I reached into the passenger seat and grabbed a blue silk button-down. Civilian camouflage. I stripped off my olive drab field jacket as I pulled the silk shirt over my shoulders. The smooth fabric caught hard on the jagged scar running up my left forearm. I shivered. My fingers moved sluggishly over the buttons, bottom to top. Putting on this shirt felt like stepping into a straitjacket. I had to bury the survivor. I had to lock away the predator that kept me breathing in the dirt. I pushed the car door open. The rusted hinges screamed. I shoved the heavy front door open and stepped inside. The smell hit me like a physical blow. A suffocating wall of burnt garlic and roasted meat. You're late. Marguerite marched out of the kitchen. She was wiping her hands aggressively on a floral apron. There was no hello. She threw an arm over my shoulder. A limp, hollow-side hug that carried zero weight. It lasted less than a second. Rupert's been cleaning all morning, she sighed. He's incredibly stressed, Beatrix. Mum keeps calling about the care facility, and he's taking the brunt of it. We all have responsibilities, you know. A precision strike. Guilt and emotional extortion wrapped in a casual complaint. I didn't argue. I just stood up straighter. My spine aligned rigid as steel. I checked the corners. I noted the blind spots. 2 exits clear. I looked down and kicked off my boots by the door. On the entry mat, 3 pairs of plush house slippers sat in a neat row. One for Rupert, one for Marguerite, one for Cassian, my 20-year-old nephew, glued to his phone on the couch. None for me. I stepped past them. My bare feet hit the polished hardwood. The floor I literally bought. It was freezing. An outsider in a sanctuary paid for with my own blood. Rupert walked out of the dining room. He didn't say a word. He just stood in the archway swirling a heavy crystal glass of single malt. The ice cubes clacked against the glass, sharp and arrogant. Dinner's ready, Marguerite announced, pointing to the far end of the long dining table. The corner seat shoved right up against the swinging kitchen door. The worst tactical position in the entire room. I walked over and pulled the chair out. Rupert descended to the head of the table, planting both elbows wide on the mahogany surface, physically expanding his footprint. Cassian slumped into the chair across from me, barely looking up from his glowing screen. This wasn't a family dinner to welcome a sister home. This was a power play. I sat perfectly still. I kept my hands resting flat on my thighs. The smell of garlic thickened in the hot air, mixing with the sharp tang of Rupert's cologne. I knew exactly what this was. I had just walked out of a literal war zone. Flown 6,000 miles to pay for the roof over his head, only to sit down right in the crosshairs of an invisible sniper. Rupert bragged about his third-quarter portfolio yields, complained about exorbitant green fees at Wentworth. I sat at the far corner, trapped between the kitchen door and a massive potted fern, chewing a piece of dry white meat. The excessive garlic butter tasted like ash. I tuned out the sound of his voice. My brain shut down his words and focused solely on his physical rhythm. I tracked his right hand. His index finger tapped the edge of the mahogany table. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, tap, pause. Erratic, undisciplined, anxious. Across the table sat Uncle Malcolm. He didn't talk. He just cut his meat. He wore a faded flannel shirt, the collar frayed. His spine was permanently curved, but his hands were steady. He held the heavy steak knife like a surgical tool. One clean slice through the beef. Malcolm slowly lifted his head. His washed-out blue eyes, permanently tired, cut through the rising steam and met mine. It was a silent transmission between two people who knew exactly what a body bag looked like when you zipped it shut. We both smelled it. The rotting, sickly sweet stench of suburban arrogance rolling off the man at the head of the table. Rupert thought he was a titan because he moved numbers on a spreadsheet. Malcolm and I knew how easily a titan bled out in the dirt. Marguerite dropped her fork. She let out a heavy rattling sigh, perfectly engineered to suck every ounce of oxygen out of the room. I had to drive 30 miles down the M4 last month, she announced. Mum's prescriptions got messed up. I spent 3 hours arguing with the pharmacist. I'm completely drained. Beatrix, at least you have it easy. The military houses you, they feed you. Our tax pounds are practically paying for your little vacation from the real world. The £5,400 check folded in my front pocket suddenly felt like a hot iron. I had signed it over so she could complain about a 30-mile drive. I had spent 35 days sleeping in body armor, jolting awake to incoming mortars just so she could play the victim. I didn't open my mouth. Instead, I gripped my fork. I pressed my right thumb hard against the sharp edge and pushed down until the skin turned bone white. The thick blue vein running down the back of my hand bulged, throbbing rhythmically against the scarred tissue of my knuckles. So, what exactly do you do? Cassian leaned forward. His elbows bumped the table, knocking over his water glass. He didn't notice. His eyes were wide, glowing with that detached cinematic hunger of a 20-year-old college kid whose entire concept of violence came from a flat screen. Like, are you a sniper? He asked, grinning. You get confirmed kills. I set my fork down. The metal clicked quietly against the ceramic. Special operations, I said. 2 words, flat, empty. Rupert didn't miss a beat. He snatched the opening, desperate to reassert his dominance. He leaned heavily onto his forearms, tilting his head down to look at me like I was a stain on his expensive rug. Special ops, huh? Rupert scoffed, swirling the scotch. Sounds highly classified. What does that actually mean in the real world? You brew the coffee for the officers? Make sure the requisition forms are filed. He chuckled, a wet, rattling sound. He looked at Marguerite, waiting for her to validate the joke. She offered a weak smile. I guess if you stay deployed long enough, it's a great way to hide from adult responsibilities. Rupert pressed, getting louder. Just keep avoiding the real work. Easier to play soldier than deal with a sick mother, right? The air in the dining room thinned out. The heat pouring from the gas fireplace suddenly felt suffocating. So since you're such a hardened combat veteran, Rupert sneered, pointing a silver fork directly at my chest. What do they call you out there? Got a tough guy nickname, Kitten? Marguerite giggled. A sharp, pathetic hiccup. Cassian smirked, looking down at his plate, embarrassed but entertained. I stopped breathing. The civilian shell didn't just crack, it shattered, falling away in jagged, heavy pieces. I leaned back against the wooden chair, slow, deliberate. It was the posture of a predator that just realized the prey had walked directly into the cage and locked the door from the inside. My eyes snapped up. I locked straight into his pupils. I didn't blink. I didn't shift. I didn't raise my voice a single decibel. But the sheer freezing mass of the silence pouring off my body hit the room like a shockwave. The giggling stopped instantly. Cassian sat up straight, his smirk vanishing. Even Rupert's hand froze, the fork suspended awkwardly in the air, his mouth half open. I let the dead air stretch. I watched the sudden primal flicker of panic twitch behind his eyes. I opened my mouth and dropped a slab of concrete right on his chest. Mad dog. Mad dog, the 2 syllables left my mouth. They didn't echo. They hit the center of the dining table and sat there heavy, dense, and freezing cold. Rupert's mocking smile was still plastered across his face. His brain was still buffering, trying to process the absolute zero temperature of the room crack. The sound was violent, bone dry. Uncle Malcolm slammed the heavy base of his crystal wine glass down onto the mahogany wood. The dark red liquid lurched, sloshing over the rim and soaking into Marguerite's pristine white table runner. It spread fast, looking exactly like a fresh arterial bleed. Malcolm's weathered, liver-spotted hand stayed locked around the stem of the glass. His knuckles went completely white. The tendons in his forearm pulled tight. "Apologize right now." Malcolm didn't yell. His voice was low, scraping the bottom of his chest. It sounded like rusted barbed wire being dragged across gravel. Rupert flinched. A genuine involuntary full-body twitch. His shoulders pulled up toward his ears. The smug suburban king, sitting at the head of the table, instantly reverted to a cornered middle management desk jockey. "Uncle Malcolm." "Come on," Rupert stammered, offering a weak, nervous chuckle. "I was just messing around." "It's a joke," Malcolm cut him off. His eyes were locked on Rupert, washed out blue, but sharp as a surgical scalpel. "Yeah, you did," Malcolm growled, leaning forward. "You just took someone else's blood and turned it into a goddamn joke." I sat perfectly still. I kept my breathing flat. "I'm fine," I said. My voice was dead, empty, monotone. Malcolm snapped his head toward me. For the first time in 10 years, he looked furious with me. He shook his head. A single sharp jerk. "No," Malcolm said, pointing a thick scarred finger at my chest. "You are not fine." Rupert felt the control slipping. This was his house, his mortgage, his expensive dining set. He gripped the armrest of his chair, the leather squeaking under his sweating palms. His neck flushed a dark, angry red. "Are you kidding me right now?" Rupert raised his voice, the pitch going high and reedy. It was a simple question about a stupid work nickname. "You're both acting like I just insulted the flag." Malcolm stood up. It wasn't a fast movement, but it was massive. The heavy wooden chair scraped violently backward. The old Marine straightened his curved spine. He planted his boots wide. His broad shoulders blocked out the light from the chandelier. A massive suffocating shadow fell directly across the length of the table, entirely crushing Rupert's physical space. "That wasn't a question," Malcolm said, his voice dropping another octave. He planted both fists flat on the table, leaning his weight over the food. "That was a challenge. And you stupid son of a bitch, just chose the wrong person to challenge." Nobody breathed. The ambient noise of the house was gone. Marguerite was frozen in her chair, her mouth hanging slightly open, taking short, shallow, panicked breaths through her nose. Clink, Cassian's fingers went slack. His silver fork slipped from his hand and hit his porcelain plate. The high-pitched chime rang out in the dead silence like an alarm bell. Malcolm ignored the noise. He kept his weight pressed into his fists, hovering over Rupert. "I was in the Falklands," Malcolm said. He ground the words out slowly. 72, Port Stanley. Sometimes names like that get tossed around. You hear them whispered in the dirt, but they aren't for showing off at some pub to get free beers. Rupert swallowed hard. His Adam's apple bobbed aggressively. The red flush on his neck completely drained away, leaving his skin a sickly pale grey. "A name like that," Malcolm continued, his voice so quiet it forced everyone to lean in to hear it, "is a warning label. It's shorthand between guys. It's a way for us to know without asking that the person carrying that name walked straight through absolute hell and did whatever it took to bring our people home. You don't earn a name like that by brewing coffee, Rupert." Malcolm whispered. Rupert physically shrank. He pressed his back hard against the leather upholstery. A bead of cold sweat broke out on his temple, catching the light from the chandelier. The alpha male facade was completely gone. He looked at me. His eyes were wide, darting, frantic. He was searching my face for a tell, for a sign that this was an elaborate prank. "So you mean," Rupert stammered, his voice cracking. "So you mean we're being played? All of this is real?" It was time. I didn't need Malcolm to fight my battles, but the old man had just pinned the target perfectly to the wall. I slowly placed my hands on the table. I grabbed the edge of my dinner plate and pushed it forward. I sat up straight. The military posture took over, locking my spine into perfect alignment. I looked at Rupert. I didn't feel anger anymore. Anger required energy. I just felt a heavy, exhausting pity. I looked at him the way you look at a scorpion that just got its stinger ripped out. Harmless, pathetic, just a noisy bug on the floor. "You don't owe me your oar, Rupert," I said. I clipped the words, dropping them like freezing rain. "But you need to learn some basic respect. You need to learn it right now, before you ever think you have the right to decide if someone else is lying." I held his gaze. The silence in the dining room became absolute. The suffocating smell of garlic butter was fading. The hum of the refrigerator died out. The polished hardwood floor beneath my bare feet felt like it was turning to sand, gritty, freezing sand. I wasn't in Weybridge anymore. Rupert's pale, terrified face began to blur, replaced by the violent, blinding flash of a mortar round, tearing through the dark night. I looked right through him. The warm amber light of the dining room started to bleed out. The suffocating smell of roasted chicken dissolved, replaced by something sharp, bitter. The back of my throat coated over with the taste of sulfur, burning diesel, and fine powdered dirt. My voice came out flat, a dead mechanical frequency. "A rescue op down in Helmand," I said. "No emotion, just the facts. Intel gave us the green light, said the valley was clear. No ambush." I paused. I let my eyes unfocus, staring past the floral centerpiece. They were wrong. Cassian stopped chewing. A piece of sourdough bread sat heavy on his tongue, his jaw slack. He was waiting for the movie scene, the slow-motion heroics, the blaring soundtrack. There was no soundtrack. "They hit us from 3 sides," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Yet it cut through the room like a serrated blade, dug into the ridgeline, heavy machine guns, rocket-propelled grenades. The sky just tore wide open. White flashes blinding you every 2 seconds. The noise. I stopped. My fingers twitched on the table. The phantom weight of body armor pressed down on my shoulders. The noise rips your eardrums right out of your skull. You cannot hear the guy screaming 3 feet next to you. You cannot hear yourself think. Rupert sat frozen. The smug financial director was gone. He looked like a cornered animal trapped in his own expensive leather chair. "We were pinned down," I continued. My gaze drifted to the cooling food on my plate, but I only saw the dark copper-soaked soil of the valley floor. Half the unit was cut off, trapped in a kill box, bleeding out in the dirt. The radio was just static, dead screaming static. Guys choking on their own blood over the comms. Marguerite covered her mouth, her manicured nails dug deep into her cheeks. Her perfect Sunday dinner was rotting right in front of her. Command came over the net, I said. Clear as day. The order was a full immediate fallback. Break contact, withdraw, get the surviving assets out of the valley. Rupert blinked, his chest heaving. The concept of losing was entirely foreign to him. He lived in a world of bailouts, padded bank accounts, and safety nets. What about the guys who were hit? Rupert stammered. His voice was a pathetic, reedy squeak. The wounded? I raised my eyes. My pupils dilated, locking onto his face with cold mechanical precision. The rules of war are not written for your comfort, Rupert, I said. When you cannot save everyone, you save the majority. The math is simple. The math is brutal. The order was to leave them behind. Write them off as a total loss. Across the table, Malcolm lowered his head. His heavy gnarled hand closed tightly around the stem of his wineglass. He knew the math. He knew the trolley problem. Malcolm closed his eyes, hiding the ghosts that were currently screaming in his own head. But Marguerite gasped, her voice trembling. You made it back. You survived. Yeah, Marguerite, I said, a hollow sound escaping my throat. I survived. Rupert leaned forward, desperate to make the numbers work. Wait, did you go back for them alone? I gave a slow, barely perceptible nod. The truth was ugly. It was not a tale of bravery. It was absolute borderline insanity. I did not get a medal for following orders, I said. The words tasted like rust. I did not get a parade. I broke protocol. I violated direct commands. I risked a full court-martial, a dishonorable discharge, and a one-way ticket to Colchester detention. I could feel the cold steel of the rifle in my hands. Not my rifle. My rifle was jammed with sand. I had ripped a fresh one out of the hands of a 20-year-old kid from Manchester who was missing the lower half of his jaw. His blood was still warm, slicking the plastic grip. I grabbed a dead man's weapon, I said, my voice dropping lower, grinding against the absolute silence, and I ran straight back into the fire. Cassian was completely white. The video game fantasy was dead. He was staring at a monster. I did not follow orders, I told them. I knew the price. I knew exactly what it would cost my career. And I went back anyway. Rupert physically collapsed. The last remaining pieces of his arrogant suburban armor cracked and fell away, leaving a terrified small man sitting at the head of a very long table. His shoulders slumped forward. His breathing was shallow, erratic. He looked at me, really looked at me, and finally saw the absolute crushing weight I carried into his house. His jaw trembled. That is why, Rupert mumbled, the words catching in his dry throat. That is why they call you Mad Dog. He thought it was an insult. A joke about a vicious, mindless killer. I ground my teeth together. I pressed my hands flat against the mahogany table. leaning my weight into the solid wood. "They do not call me that because I'm a killer, Rupert," I said. Every single syllable was a hammer strike. "They call me that because I refuse to stop. Because I refuse to listen to reason. Because I would not accept leaving my own people in the dirt just to keep my own ass safe." I held his gaze. "I spent my holidays hauling mangled bodies out of a ditch while taking heavy machine gun fire, so a guy like you could sit in an air-conditioned room and complain about his golf fees. I sold my soul in Helmand so you could sleep through the night in Weybridge." The dining room descended into a dead, suffocating silence. The verdict was delivered. The raw, bleeding truth just crushed the life out of every single petty grievance they held against me. Rupert just stared at his plate. The expensive scotch sat untouched. The ice completely melted. I slowly pulled my hands off the table. I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. "I thought you were just talking big," Rupert muttered. His voice didn't have that booming boardroom authority anymore. It was thin, papery, a pathetic, reedy sound. How did you even live through something like that?" I didn't answer right away. I let the question hang in the air. Slowly, I pushed my chair back. The wooden legs slid across the polished floorboards with a sharp, loud screech. I stood up. My spine was perfectly straight. I looked down at my plate, picked up my heavy silver fork, and let it drop. Clank, the metal hit the porcelain with a dead final thud. "I didn't live through it," I said. My voice was completely flat, devoid of heat. I carry it with me. The utter indifference in my eyes was the final bullet that put his fragile suburban pride out of its misery. He flinched, sinking lower into his collar. I turned on my heel and walked out of the room. My bare feet made no sound. I pushed through the kitchen, bypassed the living room, and stepped onto the back porch. The heavy aluminum screen door let out a sharp, rusty groan before slamming shut. The November air hit me like a physical slap. It was freezing, sharp and clean. It rushed into my lungs, stripping away the suffocating, oily stench of burnt garlic and cheap cologne. I walked over to the wooden railing and leaned my weight against it. Out here, the suburbs were quiet. Just identical colonial houses with identical manicured gardens. I reached down into my jeans pocket. My thumb caught the sharp folded edge of the £5,400 check, the money meant to pay for the very roof over my head. The money Marguerite took with one hand, while using the other to point out all my flaws. Behind me, the screen door hinges screamed again. I didn't turn around. I recognized the heavy, uneven drag of the boots. Uncle Malcolm stepped onto the porch. He had an old, faded wool cardigan thrown loosely over his broad, hunched shoulders. He didn't say a word. He just walked up to the railing, planting his large, weathered hands a few feet away from mine. Two soldiers, two different wars, standing together in the dark, breathing in the frost. We didn't need to talk. We shared the quiet, heavy understanding of people who knew what a body looked like when the life got dragged out of it. Malcolm reached into his flannel shirt pocket and pulled out a tarnished silver Zippo. Flip-clack, the heavy metal top swung open. His thumb struck the flint and a sharp yellow flame flickered into the darkness, casting deep shadows across the heavy wrinkles of his face. He lit an unfiltered cigarette, took a long, slow drag, and let the smoke drift into the cold air. The smell of cheap tobacco blended with the winter frost. "You handled that right, kid," Malcolm said. He didn't look at me. He just watched the smoke disappear into the trees. Coming back to the world, it's never a clean ride. It's always a bitch. I put my hands back into my pockets, my shoulders dropping a fraction. "Tonight was worse than a 12-mile march in full kit," I muttered, my throat dry. Malcolm let out a low, gravelly chuckle that turned into a rough cough. "Yeah, because out there you know where the enemy is dug in. Here, the worst hits come from the people sitting across the table, the ones carrying the exact same last name." He took another drag. The cherry glowing bright orange in the dark. I looked down at the dark garden below. The sheer exhaustion was settling deep into my bones, not physical. It was the mental drain of trying to play the good little sister. The tired routine of hiding the scars and watering down the truth. Malcolm shifted his weight, his old boots creaking. He turned his head, his washed-out blue eyes locking onto the side of my face. "Nights like this, they're necessary, Beatrix," the old Marine said, his voice dropping into a rough rumble. "You got to set the parameters." I kept my jaw tight, listening to the wind rattle the dead leaves. "Listen to me," Malcolm pressed, pointing the glowing tip of his cigarette toward the glowing windows of the dining room. "The people inside that house, They don't need to understand what you did out there. They're never going to get it. Their brains aren't wired for it. He snapped the Zippo shut with a loud metallic click. But starting tonight, Malcolm growled, his eyes boring into mine. They damn well have to learn to respect what they can't understand. You don't let them slide anymore. Not about the uniform. Not about the price. Something's inside my chest gave way. A tight rusted gear that had been jammed for months finally snapped into place. The phantom weight of the valley seemed to lift, leaving behind a cold, hard clarity. Malcolm was right. I didn't owe them an explanation. I didn't need their validation. My hand tightened inside my pocket. My fingers wrapped around the check, squeezing hard. I ground my knuckles until the paper collapsed, tearing and buckling under the force, crushing it into a tight, useless ball of trash. The days of letting them weaponize their petty lifestyle against my sacrifice were over. The debt was settled, but the terms of the contract had just been rewritten in steel. I looked back at the glass door of the kitchen. Inside, the silhouettes of Rupert and Marguerite were moving slow, hesitant, and completely terrified. I pulled my hands out of my pockets, left Malcolm alone with his smoke, and gripped the handle of the screen door. 7 a.m. The air inside had completely changed. Last night, the oxygen was thick, choked with the smell of roasted meat, cheap scotch, and suburban arrogance. This morning, it was just quiet. The heavy, sterile silence of a battlefield after the artillery finally stops. I stood in the guest bedroom and pulled the heavy brass zipper of my olive-drab canvas duffel bag. The sound was sharp, mechanical. I didn't have much to pack. 3 t-shirts, 1 pair of jeans. The blue civilian silk shirt was shoved at the bottom, crushed under my combat boots. I hoisted the bag over my shoulder. The thick nylon strap bit into my collarbone, familiar and grounding. I walked down the carpeted stairs. My footsteps were heavy, deliberate. I wasn't sneaking out. I took up exactly as much space as I had earned. The kitchen was flooded with sharp, blinding morning sunlight cutting through the plantation shutters. Marguerite was standing by the marble island. She wasn't wearing the floral apron or the silk dress, just a plain, oversized sweater. She didn't rush over to me. When I dropped my duffel bag by the doorway with a loud, heavy thud, she visibly stiffened. She reached for a ceramic mug, poured it full from the glass carafe, and turned around. She held the mug with both hands, extending it toward me. Her eyes stayed fixed on the granite countertop, strictly avoiding my gaze. It was a completely different posture. Cautious. Measured. It was the physical manifestation of fear distilled into a cup of black coffee. There was no sighing about a 30-mile drive. There was no passive-aggressive guilt trip. The endless stream of emotional blackmail had been permanently severed. The territory had been reclaimed. I took the mug. The porcelain was scalding hot against my calloused palm. I took a slow sip. Black, bitter, unfiltered. No sugar to mask the edge. For years, I had walked into this house trying to shrink myself. I let Marguerite treat me like a charity case because it was easier than fighting a war on 2 fronts. But that was over. I wasn't carrying their insecurities anymore. Beatrix. The voice came from the archway. Rupert stepped out of the living room shadows. The transformation was jarring. The tailored suit trousers and rolled-up sleeves, showing off the silver chronograph watch, were gone. He wore a faded grey t-shirt and worn-out sweatpants. His shoulders, usually puffed out, were slumped forward, completely deflated. He stopped walking exactly 2 steps away from me. It wasn't a conscious choice. It was an instinctual primal calculation. He kept a safe physical buffer, recognizing the threat level. Rupert started. His voice was raw. He swallowed hard, looking at the floorboards before forcing his eyes up to meet mine. I want to do better. I need to do better. I didn't blink. I took another sip of bitter coffee, waiting for him to finish. Thank you, Rupert said, his voice dropping into a quiet, raspy whisper. Thank you for not breaking my jaw last night. It was a genuine confession. The absolute unfiltered honesty of a man whose toxic shell had been systematically crushed. He wasn't asking for forgiveness. He knew he hadn't earned it. I kept my face entirely blank. I didn't smile. I didn't tell him it was okay because it wasn't. The scars were still there. The betrayal was still real, but the dynamic had permanently shifted. I was the one holding the gavel now. I gave him a single barely perceptible nod. That is enough, I said. 3 words, cold and final. I set the half-empty coffee mug down. I reached down, grabbed my bag, and slung it over my shoulder. As I turned toward the front door, Rupert stepped forward. He hesitated, his arm twitching at his side before he slowly extended his right hand. It wasn't a fake obligatory hug. It was a formal truce. I stopped. I looked at his hand, then at his face. I reached out and grabbed his hand. His skin was soft, smooth, untouched by anything sharper than a paperclip. I gripped his palm and squeezed, not hard enough to break bones, but just enough to let the thick, rigid calluses of my fingers grind against his skin. The permanent scars of gripping a rifle in desert heat. I let him feel the friction of burns, the jagged edges of a life he would never survive. His fragile masculinity had demanded a victim. But in the cold light of day, he finally realized he had tried to bully a predator. "Thank you," Rupert whispered again, flinching slightly, "for not walking away. For not abandoning us." I held his hand for one more second. I looked straight through his eyes, directly into the hollow core of his chest. "You gave me a reason not to," I said, clipping the words. "Do not lose it." I let go. I didn't look back at Marguerite. I pushed the heavy oak front door open and stepped out into the freezing November morning. The cold air felt like a baptism. I walked down the driveway toward my rusted Ford. The blinding morning sun bounced violently off the dented hood. I threw my bag into the passenger seat, climbed behind the wheel, and slammed the door shut. The rusted hinges screamed one last time. I turned the key. The old engine roared to life. A deep, aggressive mechanical growl that shattered the fragile silence. It was a blue-collar sound, rough, unpolished, completely out of place. I dropped the transmission into gear. As the truck rolled forward, I glanced at the rearview mirror. The frame perfectly captured the colonial house. Rupert and Marguerite were standing together on the front porch. They weren't waving. They weren't forcing fake smiles. They just stood shoulder to shoulder, wrapped in a quiet, solemn reverence, watching me leave. The mirror pushed them further backward, shrinking the house, shrinking the neighborhood, until they were nothing but a tiny speck. I looked away. I looked out through the windshield at the wide, empty road stretching out in front of me. I smiled. A real, genuine smile. You know, you don't need the world to understand your story to prove you exist. You don't need to rip yourself open and bleed on a dining room table to make people respect your journey. We all carry invisible ghosts. We all have a valley we walked through alone. The people who haven't seen the dark will never understand the weight of your armor, and that is fine. It is not your job to educate their ignorance. True greatness does not lie in how loud you scream for justice. It doesn't live in the arguments you win or the tables you flip. It lies in your capacity to remain silent. It lies in how long you can hold your ground, breathing quietly in the dark, waiting for the arrogant to trip over their own absolute ignorance. You just have to stand firm, set your iron boundaries, and refuse to let anyone weaponize your goodness against you. Keep your composure. Hold on to your quiet dignity, because the truth, the cold, unshakable truth, is always the most lethal weapon in the room. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to Hidden Family Infidelity and Revenge for more videos like this one. Thank you for watching.